Hi everyone, session two, technology permitting, it looks like we're good to go and we're live on YouTube. Stellar lineup again for session two. We've got Jesse Alexander, Dr. Kenny Brophy, Dr. Callum Watson, Olivia Smith, Taff Gillingham, Luke Daly-Groves and Bethany Moore, who I'm really grateful that they've
Hi
again,
everyone, session two,
same thing
technology
again, hold on.
permitting, it looks like
Sorry, that's exactly the same thing that happened about an hour ago. Yeah, what was I saying there? Yeah, so session two, absolutely stellar lineup. Really grateful to everyone for taking the time out their Saturday night to come on for Past Conversations number 20. Exact same format as we've done earlier on, hitting the guys and the girls with some questions, which they've had a wee slight bit of pre-warning about, but also given the fact that we are live on YouTube, anyone who wants to, they can comment in the chat at the side, and as much as possible, I'll try and pick up and throw any questions in as they come. So the first one is basically it's thinking about your job or your research really, and describing that and this might be painful to do so, but to describe it in 5 words. And I'm going to start with Jesse, if that's okay.
I was afraid you were going to say that. I just have it. Yeah, 5 is going to be impossible, but let's do our best. So I think, I'm the host of and researcher behind different documentary YouTube series and independent films for anyone who might not know who's watching out there. So I think if I had to describe, I would say my work is digital. It's crowd-funded. That's kind of how we sustain ourselves. It's military, it's history. I think that's 4 in between all the rambling. And the last one is important for me because I think it's a key thing of what we do. I would call it post-heroic. That's a hyphenated word, but I'm going to use it anyway. I hope you allow that.
I like that you're the first person to hyphenate, to sneak in technically a 6 word. I like that. That's clever. Over to Simon.
I'm a First World War archaeologist, so I'll try to sum it up in 5 words as well. For me, it's excavate and research, trenches and missing soldiers.
And Simon done something there probably I should have said as well. Might be worth saying exactly what it is that you do before your 5 words. Bethany.
Yeah, so I am a historian and battlefield tour guide. I would say what I do in 5 words really is dealing with children on battlefields. That's the point.
I like that because it just leaves
it just sums everything up.
As anyone who's ever been on a battlefield tour with young people would know, that's a rainbow of kind of eventualities and things that could happen. Brilliant.
All kinds of things that you don't really think about until you actually experience them.
Kenny.
Oh, well, I'm an academic archaeologist, so a lot of my job involves basically answering emails and sitting at a computer. That's sort of the majority of what I do, unfortunately. But if I were to sum up my main research strand, my 5 words are the contemporary archaeology of prehistory.
I like that. That's very fancy sounding. I like that. That's good.
Thank you.
Luke.
5 words: historian, lecturer, author, researcher, writer. I think that sums it up quite well.
Awesome. Taff.
So I'm a military historian and historical advisor, specialising in the sort of British Army of the first half of the 20th century, working film, television, theatre, stuff like that, and with an obsessive interest in the Suffolk Regiment. So I'm guessing then it's military history, research, media, and Suffolk.
Brilliant.
Suffolk.
Right, Olivia, I have to pass over to you now.
So I work across historian across TV and film. I try to think of how I could summarise that, but I think my first 2 were intense and hectic. It's also exciting. I guess I'm a researcher, and on my own personal research for history is a lot to do with women's history. So that's kind of my 5.
Cool. And last but not least, Callum.
So my technical title is Battle Coordinator at the Battle of Bannockburn Visitor Centre near Stirling. But that's a very kind of dramatic way of saying tour guide, really, and the kind of interpretation bod for the centre. My research interests, though, cover kind of 14th and 15th century Scottish politics and society, and obviously that's very keenly connected to military history as well. And I also maintain a blog that covers kind of all of that stuff as and when it occurs to me.
Awesome, thank you. I don't think I missed anyone out there. So now, sort of looking at the two sessions that we've had tonight, this one has a clear military history and archaeology theme to it. I mean, particularly, we can't hide from the fact that there's at least 4 or 5 of you who have a real strong interest in First World War history and archaeology. Poor Callum probably feeling like and Kenny, I suppose, as well, actually feeling maybe like the odd ones out in that sense. But with that
several thousand years too late for me.
With that in mind, I'm curious. I asked this earlier on during session 1. Time travel, it exists, and it's a one-off. It's a one-off opportunity. You can go back to kind of one day or one event or one time period. Where are you going, basically? Where would you go to, Bethany?
Oh, I thought you might come to me first for this one. I would be staying in my lane for this one, I suppose. I would really want to travel back to, not necessarily the First World War itself, although I would, because there's so many things I would go to, but I'd quite like to go to Armistice Day 1920 and see the unveiling of the cenotaph and the unknown warrior as arrival at Westminster Abbey. I think with the focus that's been on it this year, I think it's such an interesting period as well. That short period of time just after the war, where people are really learning how to be in a new world after such an event that had never happened before. So I think that'd be really interesting to see.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think it would be interesting to see the kind of differences from sort of modern day commemoration, and because we could go off on a tangent, and I'm hesitant to do that, but commemoration has undoubtedly changed in terms of how we remember and we commemorate. So I think going back to kind of in that sense, its inception for the unknown warrior in London would be very interesting. Taff.
Well, it's such what a question. I mean, I would be tempted to go back to Christmas Day 1914 and confiscate every football I could find. But I think, you know what? I was thinking about this long and hard. And I think, do you know what? Just for something totally different, I think I might go back to May 1966 just out of curiosity and go and have a look at the world just at the time I was being born, because I think that we all have a sort of almost romanticized view of the 60s, which I suspect would be very different if I rocked up just at the time I was being born. So yeah, just to do something totally different.
I mean, that would certainly be a surprise for your mum, for you.
It would, yes. Yeah.
It does sound like the plot for a really rubbish Channel 5 film, doesn't it?
It does. I'll get onto the commissioning editors and suggest it.
Callum, your turn.
Yeah, well, I mean, this again might be tangential, but something that I'd be interested to hear people's opinions on. I've always thought that actually time travel would be the worst invention in the world for historians, because we spend all of our time trying to make reconstructions from incomplete sources and drawing conclusions from these. And so for historians to go back and just be able to ask somebody, like, so what were you thinking when you wrote this? Like, what if we're all wrong? I can't imagine anything worse than going back in time and talking to someone whose work I think I know really well, or whose life I feel like I've done a really good job of piecing together, and them go, that doesn't sound like me at all.
I'm just thinking here, Taff, what if there was an all-out 11-a-side referee linesman?
Oh my God. I'd volunteer to be the ref and just send them all off.
Yeah, I'm actually the geek in me is almost thinking of what Callum said there, and I'm thinking of Jurassic Park when Sam Neill's character thinks, "What the hell are we going to do now that dinosaurs are back? You know,
Yeah.
what we're going to dig up almost." So, yeah, good point.
Exactly. Put us all out of the job. But I think if I could go back to a day, I would really like to go back to March, this particularly, and I had to look this date up before we started because I couldn't remember it off the top of my head, but the 17th of March, 1328, which is the day that Robert Bruce ratifies the Treaty of Edinburgh Northampton that brings the First War of Scottish Independence to an end. And as you can imagine, working at Bannockburn, Robert Bruce is a figure who I have spent an awful lot of time, thinking about and trying to teach people about. And, whenever more often than not, when you see Bruce in media and TV and films and so forth, we either get the early, really dramatic part of the reign where, and he's inevitably portrayed as this kind of idealistic young man desperate to sort of free his country from tyranny, which already is probably a bit of a ropey interpretation of who Bruce was at the start of his reign, or else we get the sort of heroic, staring inscrutably into the middle distance Bruce of, say, the Bannockburn statue. But I think the Bruce that I would really like to sort of interrogate is the Bruce at the end of the reign, when and again, sort of tying into this being the conflict session, the warfare session, that peace deal is in so many ways very, very flawed. The origins of the Second War of Scottish Independence are built into that kind of Bruce settlement of the First War of Scottish Independence. But so too is the kind of solution to that conflict. The conflict starts because that settlement in 1328 creates this class of people who've lost lands in Scotland and who have no way of regaining those lands and regaining their interests without starting another war as soon as humanly possible. And it takes 4 years for them to find that excuse, and then off we go to another 20 plus years of intermittent warfare. But the Kingdom of Scotland survives that because in the years after Bannockburn, Bruce has, he's created that, the disinherited as they're termed, by taking away all their lands, but he's given it to a whole bunch of new folks who now can't make a better peace, can't make their peace with these guys who are trying to come back because they'll have to give up all the stuff that they've given. And it has always really fascinated me how much Bruce knew that that's what he was doing. I mean, he's dying at that point. So was he just kind of fudging things and he was just kind of lucky that it all worked out in the end? Or how much did he genuinely think? Because he really pushes for the deal that he gets, although it is a fudge. He other options were at least in theory available. So I think I would naturally like to go and talk to the man himself, the boss, Robert Bruce. But it's at the end of the reign when when nobody else is really interested in, when everybody thinks it's over. I'd really like to see kind of how over he thought it was, how concrete he thought this deal was, or was he just desperately trying to get this out of the way before?
No, that's interesting. It's a kind of a reflective almost. Yeah, no, I like that, Callum. Brilliant. Same question over to Jesse.
I guess you'd probably have to work on your make sure your spoken Latin is up to snuff if you're going to chat with the Bruce. Mine certainly wouldn't be. I have two. One is a brief personal one, and that is I would just go to the days where my relatives were killed or wounded in the two world wars, and like that morning tap them on the shoulder and be like, look, if sometime today you're going to think, oh, I'd better go right, just go left, man. Just do it. Like, but historically, I think I will jump entirely out of my lane, try to meet Dr. Brophy maybe part of the way, and I'd go back to someday in the early medieval period / late antiquity period. So sometime from about 500 AD to sometime around 900 AD, because medieval history is probably my second love after 20th century military history. And that's a period there's a lot of debate, right? What really characterizes it? When does it become medieval? When does it stop being ancient history, antiquity? There's not a ton of sources. You're really stretching those fragments out, even compared to later medieval period. So I think that with the caveat that I would not catch some incredibly terrible disease and die, or be murdered as some sort of demon because I look different, or I'm tall and skinny and talk weird, or whatever, then that's where I would probably go, just because it's a total mystery and it's a kind of a fascinating one.
Yep. Yeah, I completely get that logic. Almost going something that's so distant from kind of present life, you know, it's just a completely different sphere. That makes sense. Simon.
I'm going for the obvious one. I would like to go back to one of the places I've excavated, because you spend so much time on an excavation focusing on such a small part of that battlefield, that you start to make a picture for your own, of how it looked like and how it was based on archaeological sources, on the stuff you excavated, but also the historical sources that you tried to find about that place, and go back and try to not try, but see how it actually was. That would be something I would like to do, although most of the places probably won't be places you would like to go back anyway. But yeah, that's my choice.
Olivia.
I had three. I was really greedy. I just honestly couldn't pick between one at all. One, I think I was more curious because I always read accounts of the perfect summer before the outbreak of the First World War. And I always want to know, like, was it perfect more because of people comparing it to the outbreak of the war and knowing what happened? Or was it genuinely this perfect summer, and why? I'd love to just kind of go experience like one day just before and see what happened. The inner party girl in me had to pick VE Day in London. I just feel like being in Piccadilly and just for the whole entire day would be insane to experience. Or I think if I really had to, I think I'd probably pick to go back to ancient Rome. I just love Rome so much, and I think that's where my heart, I want to retire and live there if I can, and just to see it in its grandeur and its glory would just be so magnificent. So we have a glimpse of it now when you walk around and you can see it, but just to kind of take away all the modernity and really see like what was it like back then, I think would just be phenomenal.
I can't disagree with that at all. Luke?
Like Olivia, I had three, but I sort of came to a choice. So if I very quickly tell you the first two. So number one was in Hitler's bunker the night that he committed suicide. To see his method of suicide, was it a bullet to the head? Was it a bullet in a cyanide capsule, or was it just a cyanide capsule?
Can I just Luke, what would you do on Twitter? I mean, you would have nothing to do.
Of course. The second one would be I'd like to chat to Napoleon before Waterloo. That would be the second one, but the third one, which I actually I chose, if I had one to pick, it would be like Olivia, it would be ancient Rome, but it would be somewhere in the reign of Emperor Hadrian, because I'd like to see the Pantheon and as it's just recently been constructed in all its glory. I'd like to know what local people thought of it. You know, this huge sort of dome. You can still see it today. It's still there. It's remarkably preserved. This freestanding dome structure. Just to be able to see, like Olivia said, all the monuments, Trajan's Column, the Colosseum, and just see how they would have looked when they were in their natural, the time that they were intended to be created for, with all the vibrant colour that a lot of the statues would have had, and to see how people, not necessarily the great, so I wouldn't really even be interested in seeing Emperor Hadrian so much. It'd be more what the ordinary people are up to and the things that we know less about at that time. I think it'd be brilliant, because Rome's my favourite place in the world. the Pantheon's my favourite building. So if I can get there when it's just being built, that would be fantastic.
Outstanding. Last but not least, Kenny.
Oh, this is a question that students quite often ask about. If only you could get a go back in time and watch them building Stonehenge, or find out what these weird burial rites were about and things like that. But I mean, I've always felt that even if I could go back thousands of years to watch what was happening or to try and make sense of it, I don't think I'd understand what people were up to, because there was such a different set of cultural traditions in terms of things like how they treated the dead, or how their religious beliefs, the way that society was organized. I actually think that it would just make it even more confusing than it already is. It's much better for me to be able to look at the stuff that we have from then and to put my own spin on it, and not have that challenged by even more weird and anomalous data from actually watching these people do these strange things. So I think for me, actually, I'd quite like to go back to a 20th century event that's really close to research I've been doing, looking at prehistoric rock art sites in near Clydebank and Faithfully, and the site I've been looking at is a site called the Cockno Stone, which is one of the biggest prehistoric rock art sites in Britain. It's 100 square meter rock that's covered in lots and lots of cup and ring marked symbols, and it's an amazing site. But in September 1937, an eccentric antiquarian called Ludovic McClellan Mann painted the whole of the surface of the stone with oil paints, and covered it in a weird grid that was of his own devising. Prehistoric measurements that he'd made up. He coloured in all of the prehistoric symbols, and he added all sorts of other bits and pieces. And he didn't really ever publish much about what he was doing. And even though I've studied the grids and his metrical measurements and looked at his other work and to contextualise it, I still can't really quite work out what the hell he was going through his mind, that he thought it was a good idea to cover an enormous prehistoric rock art site with 5 different colours of lead oil paint. So I'd like to go back to... Sorry, I'd like to go back then and, maybe, who knows? I'd like to go back and ask Ludovic Mann, what are you doing, man? With that little pun at the end, added, of course.
Brilliant. Okay, the next one has the potential to cause furious debate. There's sort of 2 ways, maybe 3 ways of answering this, because I'm putting it out there as in, what is the best and stroke or worst historical movie? And I think there's lots of ways to approach this, because if you come at a historical movie in terms of accuracy, then that's going to cause criticism, undoubtedly. But if you come at it just in terms of pure enjoyment, then that's perhaps a different angle. So it's up to you if you want to say best and worst, or maybe just a movie that has good elements of bad. I have no idea. I'll start with Callum.
All right. So I again, there's like 3 movies that like I wanted to flag up. The first one I feel kind of duty bound to mention. If you are willing to sit through about 15 minutes worth of credits on the film Outlaw King, you'll see my name as a historical advisor on it. So I'm kind of honor bound to give that a mention as the most accurate depiction of 14th century Scottish history that you'll see on the big screen, which I say because that's a very relative term. It's only really got to go up against Braveheart, and that is just horrendous every way you cut it. Braveheart, the script writer, Randall Wallace, claimed to be inspired by The Wallace, which is a late 15th century poem about William Wallace that I did my PhD on. And so I even once tried for a paper I presented to look at Braveheart as an adaptation of The Wallace, because The Wallace is basically no use for an account of Wallace's life. It's written 150 years after he died, based mainly on kind of weird folk tales, and all sorts of crazy stuff goes on in it. He has a vision of St. Andrew and Mary, who commission him to go out and rescue Scotland. He sees a ghost at one point. He gets in a fight with the King of France's lion. So it's like The Wallace is not a very trustworthy source anyway. So I thought maybe if you look at Braveheart as being an adaptation of that, maybe it will kind of give it a framework where you can kind of understand where it's coming from. And to be honest with you, it doesn't even work as an adaptation of the already not very accurate thing that it's adapting. But the one film that I would kind of unironically put out there as the best medieval film, and I absolutely 100% stand by this, no joke, is A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, because although it is chock full of anachronisms and inaccuracies in and of itself, both grand in terms of, you know, them singing Queen songs at jousts, and little things about, you know, little niggly things about armor, or that coat of arms shouldn't be there, or whatever else. There's no medieval film, I think, anywhere except maybe Holy Grail, that Monty Python and the Holy Grail, that so encapsulates kind of the tone of what it's trying to represent. You know, Paul Bettany standing there giving it rice, talking about, you know, having seen Heath Ledger, you first met him, you know, and he spent a year in silence in Italy to better understand the sound of a whisper, and then going off and rescuing some, you know, virgin in Spain from her, you know, wicked Turkish uncle and stuff. Nothing better encapsulates what the job of a herald at a tournament was supposed to do for the thug that was going to come out there and bash some other guy with a stick. You know, those strange looking peasants standing around singing Queen songs really give you a sense of like what it was like to be some rando who's just come into the town for the day to watch the spectacle of, you know, a tournament happening. So although it, like kind of every medieval movie, has lots of weird things where it's very clear that people have just been going and, oh well, we'll dress them in that because it's brown and everybody in the medieval period dressed in brown, or, you know, just picking armor that must have been used in like English Civil War dramas previously. The film itself really just encapsulates what kind of 14th century chivalric society was like, and at the end of the day, it's that is at the sort of heart of my research interest. So yeah, and A Knight's Tale, I will fight anyone
this is where
it's the best medieval movie you'll find.
This is where I get to annoy Callum by saying two things. One, I've never saw A Knight's Tale, and two, for all the fact that it is utterly guff, and every fibre of my being tells me I shouldn't like Braveheart, I really do like Braveheart. So Braveheart was still quite high up. I mean, I'm a history teacher in Scotland. What the hell would I be doing if I don't have Braveheart?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Sorry, I'm going to go over to Luke now.
It's funny. I did a sort of undergraduate essay on public history, and one of the sort of not chapters, paragraphs I researched for it was film, and the film I chose to illustrate for bad history was Braveheart. And I just went through books to sort of compare what actually happens in Braveheart and what actually happened in real life. So that, you know, there's a really bad bit in the film where they grant the right of prima nocta, which is like the right of noblemen to sort of sleep with the recently married, and apparently that never happened. And that's one of the most sort of moral sort of underpinning things of the film, is an outrage, and it just never happened. So that's just one of the. But I agree with you that it's actually a brilliant film if you don't look at it as a sort of historical record in terms of like the epic on screen and the sort of, you really want William Wallace to succeed just because of the injustice that he sort of suffers at the hands of the terrible English, which are made to be more terrible than they actually were in some ways. So I agree that it's a good film in its own right, but as a sort of lesson in history, it's not so good. Best film, most accurate film for me would be perhaps predictably it would be Downfall, the one in German with English subs about Hitler in his bunker, purely because I read the sort of interrogation transcripts of people that were in Hitler's bunker, and they sort of they recall what Hitler says in the bunker, and at certain key stages in that film, what Hitler says in the film is almost verbatim from what I read in the transcripts of the interrogation. So it is actually really accurate to the historical record, and it's so impressive what they did with that film. And I think it's something rare that you don't see in a lot of historical films, and I'd like to see more of it. Definitely with Braveheart as well. I mean, if they could have told the story of William Wallace, trying to be a little more accurate, it would have been fantastic to have that sort of the epic scale and the just the cinematography of it all is brilliant. I just wish they'd be more accurate and stick to sources more often.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and I'm holding off on Taff here because I think I just got a feeling he's got.
You've broken up, so I've no idea what you just said.
It's me. I'm disrupting the signal here, so we don't get so much Braveheart.
I just committed you to something, Taff. You have to do it now. It's tough.
I have no idea what it is, but yeah, go on.
No, I was just saying. I think I'm going to come to you last. I don't know why. I've just got a feeling that you've got a few things to say on this in terms of, but there is this huge dilemma, I suppose, between enjoying a film as a film equally, and again, I know this selfishly as a teacher that, and Luke picked up there in the Prima Nocte, for example, and whatnot, that people, young people, old people, anyone kind of could to an extent take a film as gospel and say, well, I've watched this film, therefore I know about X, Y, and Z. And I think this is why anyone who's got a vested interest in history, that we get kind of uptight about this, and I think it's rightly so. This debate's not going anywhere. Simon.
I honestly, I don't. When I watch movies, it's for me, it's purely to enjoy a quiet evening. So I. How do I? I don't like pay attention to the small details, like is the costume right, and is that, and so for me, if a film, if I have the feeling or the sense that the film is kind of correct and it could have happened that way, I am like okay with it. From the moment I have a feeling that it's not, I can't finish the film either. So it's something in between. If I have to pick a movie, I don't really have like this is the best of or the most accurate movie for me. So I picked a movie that for me meant a lot in my in my interest, and that's All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a movie I've watched I don't know how many times from the moment I got that interest in the First World War. I know probably if you look at the accuracies, it won't all be completely correct, but it's just a movie that means a lot to me, and that's why I picked that one.
Presumably the 30s one, yeah?
Sorry?
Presumably the 1930s one.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, just checking.
Olivia.
I think for me, that even as a historian, I very much see like historical films as entertainment. I guess like Simon said, I won't sit there and like nitpick or anything. I just enjoy them for what they are. Because I think for me, especially like when I've got into certain areas that I've been extremely passionate about, it's because like I watched a film or a TV series and I thought, oh, I want to learn more on that. I feel like, so for me, watching the first 20 minutes of Private Ryan in school and then coming home and saying to my mum, please can I watch Band of Brothers? I then went and learned the entirety of the Second World War history on my own as a 13-year-old. And I feel like I really appreciate films for that. So when I've watched like the Downton Abbey film, which if anyone knows, I'm a huge fan of Downton Abbey. And I just love the ideas of how you can bring history to life in an hour and a half or an hour's episode, and you can whack it on TV. And whether or not people are interested in film, that area of history, they'll sit there and they'll enjoy being transported into the past and like having it brought back to life. And I think it's so captivating how we can do it. And I don't think, obviously, we need to be very particular on what is historically accurate and what isn't. And, there's kind of a grey line on what directors and producers want to put forward. But I think if you have that ability to kind of spark the imagination and deliver more in terms of history in an hour on TV or in a cinema than possibly a child or someone could get from, say, reading a book, I think is really powerful. So for me, just like there's been so many films, I just think I sit back and I love it because I just feel like my inner history geek's there. I'm being transported into the past, and I just absolutely love it.
Brilliant. Kenny.
Well, I mean, I'm exactly the same. You know, I enjoy films, not for their historical accuracy or any of that sort of stuff, but just because I enjoy some historical films that might evoke a certain period. You know, I really enjoy Gladiator, because you know I think it depicts. I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but I think it does depict, for instance, fight scenes between Iron Age people and Romans quite well. And I love films like The Witchfinder General, which have got an English Civil War angle to them, but that's only a minor part of the narrative. But I guess when we're talking historical films, the absolute pinnacle, and I recommend that you watch this if you've not seen it before, is Hammer's 1967 film, The Viking Queen, which you might be surprised to know has got nothing to do with Vikings, but in fact is really a retelling of the Boudica story around the time of the Roman invasion. And it's just outrageously crazy in every respect. I used to always show it as a kind of film night on our summer field schools to the students who were completely bamboozled that such a film could ever be made. But it's got Romans in tiny togas. It's got druids with outrageous crowns. It's got human sacrifice at stone circles and Anglesey. It's got a barbarian Iron Age leader called Nigel. It's got Patrick Troughton from Doctor Who's in it. It's just it's incredible. It's a completely mad film that only Hammer could have made, and it's everything that's truly terrible about COD history, and yet also it's just pure 120 minutes of entertainment. So I highly recommend it.
Right, well, we're all watching that then. Bethany.
I mean, I completely went down the war film route. I think I will unashamedly admit that I am a nitpicker.
Good.
I was going to say I'll join Taff on this one. I am a nitpicker, but that I can still appreciate a film for its media appeal and the broad appeal. But I can just sit there and I do think to myself, surely it's not that hard to just get the basic details correct. Surely it's not that difficult. But you know, no film is accurate 100%. So as long as at least if they give it a go, I can be placated. But I think for me, historically, I did go down war films, and I think for me the best one is I'd like to see people argue with it. The Great Escape. I think it's such an iconic piece of cinema and it's such a powerful piece of film, and the fact that it's loosely based on a true story. You know, I know they've changed elements of the story to make it appropriate for the film and what works on camera, but it's just such an iconic piece of film. Like, you can just start to hear everyone, as soon as I said The Great Escape, I can almost guarantee that everyone started with the theme tune in their head. Everyone knows what it is, and it's just such a powerful piece of cinema. But then conversely, I did have to pick a worst film as well, and I think the First World War experts and people with the interest in the First World War will agree with me on this. I think the worst
drum roll
film is Passchendaele, because it's just so bad. Like, there's just no words to describe how bad it is, really. And that is an example of surely it's not that difficult to just ask someone some questions to get it right.
That's what's his name? Paul
Gross. Paul Gross, yeah. The infamous Canadian filmmaker.
I think that's a perfect inroad for Jesse to pick up now.
Yes, mea culpa on behalf of my fellow Canadian. Actually, where I used to work in a museum in Canada at the time, when that film came out, we showed like a special premiere and stuff, and I was like dry heaving in the corner in the back while everyone else is like, ooh, look, he's going up like Jesus with the cross and the oh god. But anyway, so I'm not going to argue with your selection there. No, not even my patriotism can help poor Paul. As far as I'm concerned, I don't nitpick. I hope I don't. But I try to stay away from most feature films because I know that a film is art, but I think the majority of the time it's consumed as history by the majority of the viewers. And I know this, but I have so much emotional difficulty accepting it that it bothers me. As far as worst films are concerned, I will just extend the Braveheart conversation to say Mel Gibson's involvement in any historical based film. Like, what was that terrible, The Patriot? I couldn't finish. I regretted starting. There was some other one. I wrote it down. I mean, Gallipoli is another. But anyway, let's try to stay positive. I would say two that I really felt were good at bringing across what I felt was a worthwhile artistic and historical experience. One is Beowulf, because I feel like if you can take me back, you can try to give me a sense of what this historic culture's legends were like, right? That's fine. You're not trying to tell me exactly what, Viking Anglo-Saxon culture was like. You were trying to tell me what feeling their legends had. And so I thought that was a pretty cool experience, even though I got motion sickness from the 3D. Yeah, I know it happens to me all the time. And then the other one is a classic war film. It's from the 80s, from 1985, from the Soviet Union, called Come and See, Iti Ismatri, for all of our Russian speakers out there in the audience. And it's the story, if you don't know it, it's the story of a teenage peasant boy in Belarus from a village when the Germans arrive, and how traumatic that whole experience is for him and for the other villagers, and how disjointed and chaotic the whole experience of war is. And the film is very Russian. It is disjointed, it's chaotic, it's like artsy abstract in places. So it's not very Hollywoodish, but I felt like in terms of getting across that, like, doesn't make sense, traumatic, chaotic, the Germans are in the wrong, but they're not smashing you over the head with sappy representations of that. It's so raw that I felt like that was a pretty good way to try to get that historical feeling across, let's say. So Come and See. That's my pick.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. Last but not least, Taff.
Oh, where to start? I think Beth, Passchendaele's right up there, although I do think that Joyeux Noel definitely gives it a run for its money in terms of truly awful filmmaking. Downton Abbey, just touching on Downton's a good example, actually, having worked on series 2, where, it's just Sunday night entertainment, it's froth, it really is, but there's little stuff. Julian Fellows had written a scene where, whatever his name is, the Matthew Crawley gets wounded as just some random date in 1918. And I said, look, I know it means nothing to you, but how about we set it on the 8th of August, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army, and kind of make the point that Crawley might get himself almost killed, but it was a worthwhile venture. Oh yeah, fantastic, we'll do that. So that would have meant nothing to 99% of the people watching it, but, little wins. And you do get little wins. You can also have big wins as well. I think that the thing to remember is that if you're making a documentary, I'll fight you to the death to tell the true story or get it as right as we can. Or if not, I won't help you because there's no point. If it's drama, the starting place is always going to be compromised because, quite frankly, warfare is a thoroughly, thoroughly tedious business most of the time, with lots and lots and lots of nothing happening at all. So if you want to make a really true story, then, it's going to be very dull. Think back to the Australian series Anzacs in the 80s or early 90s, where they literally took Bean's history of the Anzacs and inflicted every single interesting thing that happened to every battalion in the whole of the Australian Imperial Force and inflicted it onto one unit just to make a story. So, yes, there's, there needs to be drama or no one's going to watch it. Having said that, then there is no reason why you can't get the detail right. There are people paid to do that job. There are costume designers, there's art department. A lot of those people paid far more than historians. So why shouldn't they get the detail right? And I mean, we've been very lucky over the years that I've got to work with an awful lot of people who really want to do it properly. Even right down to the Dad's Army, the Lost episodes we did last year, where Howard Burden, the costume designer, said, right, I want to get this right. I want to get it right for this particular, exactly this period. So if you can get it right for Dad's Army, well, there's no reason why you can't get it right for a film. I mean, I think from a personal point of view, Journey's End, which we did, which was screened, finally came out in March 2018, appropriately. With that, we just moved heaven and earth to make sure all of the detail was as right as it possibly could, because it made no difference whether it was right or wrong. So it might as well just be right. So the uniforms are right, the weapons are right. There's a couple of tiny, tiny annoying things that the art department managed to sneak in, a 1940 dated ammunition box and a couple of Second World War brass cannon shells, which was daft because it didn't need to be there. And obviously Sheriff had written the stuff in the 20s, and they'd gone out of their way to get it as close to the book as they possibly could and to capture that mood. I mean, I think if there was one bit of drama that was kind of twisted, it's the whole battalion commander being the sort of old duffer, which the writer decided it needed to have for a bit of drama. Whereas in reality, if you just look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, in the week after the 21st of March 1918, if you look at lieutenant colonels, 18, 20, 24, they're predominantly very young fellas who were commanding battalions, and absolutely nothing like the sort of cartoon character. But really, that's about the only thing that that I look back now and think, well, that's a bit of a shame. So the point I'm kind of making is that it really doesn't take much effort to do this stuff properly if you can be bothered. I mean, the problem is that the starting point in most instances is that the people making the films don't have any idea of a history, but have a very fixed idea of how they think history was. So virtually every producer or director that we come into contact is, their starting point is, General Haig was a butcher and a bungler, lions led by donkeys, it was all a dreadful slaughter, and it's all mud, blood, and everyone gets killed for nothing. That's the starting point. So if that's the starting point, if I'm lucky enough, if I get employed early enough to work on it, I can have a sensible conversation with them. And very often you talk them around and they go, oh, that's really interesting. And you can have that influence on them. But there are other directors who won't have anything to do with the advisors that they get on board, and the advice is completely ignored. But I suppose that the point I'm making is that it doesn't cost any more to do it properly than it does to do it badly. And every time historians go, oh, it's only entertainment. Well, it's another mountain that you have to fight because somebody else has just piled up another heap of ahistorical nonsense for you to then have to deal with. Because, as one of you has already said, people do believe it. It becomes history. It just does, because it's much more accessible to go and watch a film than to read a heavyweight tome that some very, very clever person has written. That's just a fact. But if we could get to the stage where people say, well, actually, we may as well get the detail right, because there are some fantastic stories. I mean, obviously, I'm talking specifically First War because it's what I know. But the part of the problem is because we've ended up with the media creating this ridiculous situation where they've taken a fascinating subject, a war that lasts over 4 years on virtually every continent, and with so many stories and so many fascinating aspects to it, and they've taken it and they've just squeezed it into this tiny little ball that just says it's all about mud, blood, and everyone gets killed for nothing. Oh, and there's a bit of poetry. And once you've done that, you can't tell all the other stories because they're all outside this ridiculous little lump you've created. But if you can break out of that, then the possibilities are endless. And one day they'll get to see that, and they won't keep making exactly the same film over and over and over again, just with a different cast and a slightly tweaked story and a different title, which is what they do at the minute.
Bravo. Just picking up as well, I should have said earlier on, multitasking's not my thing. A couple of wee comments coming in on YouTube on the comments section. Just back to a previous question, someone saying how they'd love to travel back in time to Berlin when the wall was being erected, so which the kind of Cold War geek historian in me would love. Obviously would probably rather be on one side of the wall than the other, I'm sure. But but that, that's got an interesting one. And also a movie suggestion which I haven't watched before, which is The Last Centurion. Has came in as one, and they've written off the back of that. Let me get the quote up. Favorite historical movie, but the vast majority of it is based on speculation. On somebody just put in there. There's Andy Locke saying, "Write a script, Taff." So there you go. And write a film. What are you waiting on? I should have said that earlier on. Anyone that's watching on YouTube, by all means, drop in a comment, because I'm trying my best to keep one eye on that as best as I can. So moving on, a question I asked earlier on. I'm repeating it for you guys, and it's the Boaty McBoatface one. So if you were to, be tasked with the mission of naming a boat after a figure from history, who would it be? And I'm going to start with Olivia for this one.
The pressure. I picked Gloria Steinem. I think the inner kind of feminist in me really thought it'd be good for her. And I feel like with the first wave feminists are really important, and everyone, we do know them quite well and what their really important contribution was to where women are today. But I think the second wave feminism is kind of overlooked, and she's very much a frontier for that, and what she did and how vocal she was into making sure that I think transported women into this kind of modern world, kind of getting them away from the typical 1950s housewife and all this other stuff. And she was very prominent in America. I think you can, to come back to TV and film, Mrs. America, that's just been on BBC, is really interesting at looking at the story, and she's one of the key characters there. So I think it'd be nice to kind of see some of these women who have made really valuable contributions to our modern society now and be recognised.
Thanks, Olivia. Simon, same question.
I've gone for a personal answer again. For me, it would be Uncle Jack, which is Captain Henry Walker, which is a New Zealand captain, a soldier that we covered in 2016. He was the first soldier that we were able to identify. So for me, there's like an unexplainable bond that I have with that man, although I never knew him and I don't have any connection with him as a family or whatever. He is always on my mind somehow, so that's in a way to honor him, I would pick him.
I unless I'm wrong, Simon, I think we chatted about him before when we last.
Probably because I often chat about him.
I think over a pint we were having a chat about him. That rings a bell. Luke, same question.
Oh, it's a difficult one, isn't it? There's so many figures from history that probably deserve a ship named after them, but I think you'd have to go for somebody military, I suppose. I suppose on the question, I don't know why they didn't call the original ship Boaty McBoatface. I thought that was unfair. So they had a vote, didn't they? And then they decided to name the ship Boaty McBoatface was the one which won the vote. I thought it was incredibly cruel and anti-democratic that they didn't actually call the boat Boaty McBoatface. It won the vote. Let's support democracy here. We want HMS Boaty McBoatface or whatever it was supposed to be. I don't know. I guess does it have to be a British ship? Is it any ship?
Absolutely, your discretion. It could be a ship that's sailing the seas of the moon. I have no idea.
Maybe I'll go for Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, I think, because I think he gets unfairly overlooked quite a lot in favour of his more famous uncle. So I think Louis Napoleon would be my vote to name a ship, because he did so much for France. He modernised France. The Paris that we know and love today, so much of it is because of his sort of schemes and his oversight of the architecture and the infrastructure. And he was a great friend of England as well. He was a champion of the Entente Cordiale. So Louis Napoleon would be my vote.
Okay, cool. Look, Callum.
I've got maybe a slightly oddball choice for mine. So until recently, I was also working at Blackness Castle, and the guy who built Blackness Castle is a guy called Sir George Crichton. who was Admiral of Scotland. He's the second person known to ever have occupied that office, although we've no evidence whatsoever of him actually doing anything as part of that office. It just really seems to have been a bit of a courtesy title for him. And he, in his lifetime, he flourishes from about the 1420s through to his death in 1454. And he is quite a sort of mover and a shaker at the court of James I and during the minority of James II. And so he's a kind of important-ish figure in Scotland in his own time, right the way up until in 1453. So about sort of 18 months before he dies, his cousin, William Crichton, who was the Chancellor, dies. And it immediately becomes clear that actually George Crichton is just the kind of idiot relative who's been riding on William's coattails, because he goes from being, you know, a real sort of figure of import to at the court of James II to being bullied out of all of his inheritance by James II, and then he gets imprisoned at Blackness Castle by his own son, who's up in arms that he's kind of sold the family jewels to James II. So probably not a figure that deserves a boat named after him, but again, like the Bruce thing, having worked at Blackness and, you know, spent 18 months thinking about the guy and what he got up to and why he built the castle and why he built it the way that he did, and, you know, I've developed a kind of affection for the guy. So yeah, I guess I would name a boat George Crichton, despite the fact that although he was technically an admiral, we have no reason to suppose he had any affinity with the sea or, you know, any interest in having a boat after him.
Cool. Kenny?
Well, it's tricky for me because we don't really know the names of anyone in prehistory. So, you know, I don't know, we could maybe call the boat, you know, after the person who invented fire, or the first person that decided to eat that red mushroom to see what happened, or the first person that the person that gave the extra heave that managed to get one of the big stones at Stonehenge up, or something like that. So it could be quite abstract. But I suppose from my point of view as an archaeologist in Scotland, I'm thinking about great Scottish archaeologists, and one of the most unheralded is probably Audrey Henschel, who did an incredible amount of work in the 50s through to the 80s, documenting all of the Neolithic chamber tombs of Scotland at a time when it was incredibly difficult to be a woman in Scottish archaeology. And she created an amazing starting point for all subsequent research on that particular topic. So I think I'd like to celebrate Audrey in the naming of the boat.
Awesome. I don't want to miss anyone out. Bethany, we've not been to you yet for this one.
No, not yet. Oh, I'm next, right? Okay, I didn't realise. I haven't gone with anyone from the First World War. I've gone for more of a local history to where I am. I did have a think about it, and I would name the ship after Mary MacArthur. She was a trade unionist in the early 1900s. But the particular incident that I would name the ship after her for is in 1910. She was a really vocal advocate for women in the next town along from where I live, which is called Cradley Heath. And it was an industry that where they made chains in Cradley Heath, and they still do actually today. But women used to work in their houses, well, in outbuildings, in really, really poor, squalid conditions, and they were just paid starvation wages, basically. And they had no one to help them really get their message forward about equal pay, fair pay. And it is one of the first, it's not the first, I don't think, but it's one of the first instances where we see women striking for equality. They go on strike for 10 weeks. They're not making any of the chains, which in a heavy industrial area where I live in the Black Country, like the Black Country Museum, where they do film part of Peaky Blinders as well. So it's a very heavy industrial area, always has been. And these women fought for their rights and won. They went on strike for 10 weeks, and eventually on the 22nd of October, I think it was in 1910, they finally got the last employer to agree to pay the minimum wage at the time, and they were led by Mary MacArthur. And she was very famously said that for these women, she says that for the chain makers, women are unorganized because they are badly paid, and poorly paid because they are unorganized. And she stepped forward and really galvanized the attitudes of the starting blocks for equality for pay, and so I would name my ship after her.
Yep, I like that one. Jesse?
All right. Well, first of all, I should start this by saying that I don't really like the sea, and I don't care for being on boats. So that is kind of the inspiration for my suggestions. You know, I've always wondered why, let's say the Royal Navy in this case, didn't take the opportunity to kind of rub salt in the wounds and sort of name a ship after like the Spanish admiral at Trafalgar. Just so you can always be like reminding whoever that guy was of how that went down, or the admiral of the Armada or something, you know, just every time it's being pushed in your face what happened. I think that would be a boss move, to use a bit of internet culture term there. But failing that, I would have a suggestion for the German Navy, since in general the German armed forces have to do a bit more thinking about how they name things than many others, or they should, let's put it that way. And I did some research about two women who were executed for their troubles resisting the Nazi regime, and I kind of thought it would be a good idea. One was a woman by the name of Oda Schottmüller, and the other was Marianne Goltz. And they were both artists. One was like a sculptor, one was a singer, and they ended up, one got Jews out through Prague. She herself was a Jew. And then the other, allegedly, although she denied it to the end, but it seems quite likely, she allowed left-wing resistors to meet in her studio and try to potentially radio the Soviet Union and warn them of the impending attack. And I did some research about them for an exhibition at the Juno Beach Center about significant women in World War II. The Juno Beach Center is a Canadian World War II museum in Normandy. So yeah, maybe the Kriegsmarine will take me up on the idea, but I guess I won't hold my breath.
Well, Jesse, I think trying to keep track is just tough. I've not been to you yet for this, Taff.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, well, kind of thinking that you know, famous people always have boats and buildings named after them, and I've been doing some catching up, actually, some research on the 18th City of London Home Guard, which I bought a big file of documents about 10 years ago. And 18th London Home Guard, one of their platoons were based at Dollis Hill, the GPO Research Centre in the North London. And at the time, I used to work, ran a design studio, the audiovisual design studio, for the BT's research place at Martlesham Heath near Ipswich, which was where Dollis Hill's research station moved to in the 1970s. And some of the people who worked at Dollis Hill during the Second World War were the people that went on to build Colossus. So people like Tommy Flowers had been in the Home Guard, and Sid Broadhurst was with them as well. And there were still people working, or who literally just retired at BT at Martlesham, who'd worked with them, who'd been in the same offices as them during the war. And so at the time, I managed to capture some of the memories of the people who were still alive. Put it away, forgot all about it because I was too busy. But it's only been recently, Peter Hart, a couple of weeks ago, was talking about the fact that he'd interviewed Tommy Flowers, I think in the 80s. And I said to him, I said, did he tell you anything about his time in the Home Guard? He said, well, no, and I didn't think to ask because I thought they'd all have been too busy. But it's absolutely fascinating. You go through these documents and there they all are, clearly all these people who are vital, really seriously vital to the war effort. And there's a fantastic piece in here by a Lance Corporal, and his memories. I'd written to him and said, what can you tell me about your time in the Home Guard? And there's just this wonderful paragraph where he says, one memory I had, we had a big exercise at Dollis Hill where we were attacked by the Coldstream Guards. And he said, for this particular exercise, Tommy Flowers and Sid Broadhurst, who'd already started working on what would become Colossus, they'd had a really busy week, so they were told that they could go home early and they didn't need to be part of the exercise. And just as they were leaving, the Coldstream Guards launched this attack. They put down a huge smoke stream. Bearing in mind, this is right in the middle of a housing estate, and the Coldstream Guards were attacking through people's gardens with ladies trying to shoo them off with brooms. And one of them threw this enormous thunder flash with 3 or 4 thunder flashes strapped together, which he threw at 2 blokes that he saw emerging out of the smoke, which turned out to be Tommy Flowers and Sid Broadhurst. And the bang was enough, it broke their glasses and tore half their clothes off. So yeah, when you realise that the Coldstream Guards had been that close to wiping out Colossus and most of that incredible work at Bletchley Park just by accident. And the only reason that I know that is because a wonderful fella with the fantastic name of Lance Corporal Monty Meatyard had remembered that and written that down. And I think, to be honest, anybody who'd worked at Dollis Hill as part of that project with those amazing people building Colossus and all the other things they were doing, especially somebody called Monty Meatyard, certainly deserves to have a ship called HMS Monty Meatyard named after them.
Love it, Taff. Thank you so much. Just looking now, just catching up on the comments from YouTube. Going back to the questions about films, we've got a shout for Dunkirk coming in.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother shouting it too loudly.
I get it's another one of those films that I know it's bound to divide people, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I like Dunkirk.
Great piece of entertainment.
Yeah, I really do like that film. Where are we going next? Rich Owens. Oh goodness, I'm trying to think what question this would have been in relation to. They're talking about Gertrude Bell, saying a female version of Indiana Jones comes from my hometown in Washington. I don't know if that's maybe about naming the boat after, possibly. Stuart Borland, art teacher at Clydebank High, shout out to him. He's popped in. I think this is about going back in time to a point. He's talking about Sarajevo, 1914, the start of World War I. So I'm assuming the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, to sort of see that happening. Lindsay McDougall's wrote in boats would name Irina Sendler and Mary Seacole, who, from what I know, are both nurses. And then I am conscious of time, but it is a Saturday night, so I think we can go a bit here. We've got a question. We don't all have to answer this, so I'm putting you on the spot here, but someone has said, and I'll do it verbatim. It's actually got a chap called Robert Atkinson who's watching, and he says, without the glaringly obvious, if you could remove or amend a significant historical event, what would it be? Now, I'm just going to take a gamble here and say that with glaringly obvious, he probably means things like the Holocaust, or something huge like a war or something like that. But if you could just sort of remove a time period or an event in history, what would it be? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that. That is an interesting one.
I think
everyone starts scratching their chins there.
I think I'd leave it well alone. Don't touch it, because it might spoil it. We might suddenly all find ourselves out of a job with all the knock-ons.
Yeah.
Right. I tell you what. Think about it. Think about it. Maybe someone will come back to it. And the last question, anyway, for us before we were finishing up, anyway, was I suppose thinking about where you are now in your careers and your research and these types of things. If you imagine back to sort of a crossroads in your life. If you weren't doing what you're doing now, where do you think you might be? And I think I'll start with Jesse for that one.
Well, I suppose that depends. There are a couple of crossroads, I guess, I've had in my lifetime that had a big impact. I think if we put the crossroads a little earlier in my teenage years, I'd be a pig farmer in Canada, like my father. And his father, and his father, and his father, and his father, going back to the time when they left Ireland about 200 years ago. But I think a little more recently, before I just quit my day job and jumped into the independent documentary film career that I now have with all of its ups and downs, I'd probably still be spending my days as the head of the Student Services and Co-Curricular Learning Department at a university here in Vienna. And so I kind of never looked back, don't regret it. And now, to plug my latest project before we go, we're making a new documentary on the Rhineland campaign in 1945 called Rhineland 45. It's on Indiegogo now. There you go. Sorry, folks. Had to do it. Paul, did we lose you? Was that too much? Did I offend Paul's? Am I in the doghouse now? Or
I'm here. I'm furiously multitasking. That's the problem.
Okay, I see.
Exact same question to Luke.
I always wanted to be an archaeologist. So I'm a historian at the moment, but the first job I ever said I wanted to do was to be an archaeologist, and it was particularly an Egyptologist. It sort of evolved from archaeology to Egyptology, because I really loved just ancient Egypt. I was always fascinated by it. You know, the culture, the arts, the monuments, the way they mummified the dead, just everything about ancient Egypt I used to love. So I used to want to be an archaeologist. And that's partly why I like the Indiana Jones movies. So we were talking before about sort of bad history, and you know, I'm all in favour of giving bad history a kick, but I think Indiana Jones is supposed to be a bit of fun. So I love Indiana Jones, and as a kid I used to love it as well, and that's partially what sort of helped me keep an interest in history. So yeah, if I wasn't a historian, I think I'd be an archaeologist. I hope that's not a sort of cheat answer to the question, because I know this is sort of archaeology/history panel, but yeah, I'd go into archaeology.
I've got to then go to one of the archaeologists. I'll go to Kenny next then.
Oh, I don't know. I've been doing this for a long time, and I guess I think that there hasn't been really that many crossroads. I mean, the reason I came into archaeology was I initially went to university to do geography, cartography. I wanted to make maps, that kind of thing. And then I worked with a guy in a local bingo hall, believe it or not, who had done archaeology, and he offered to give me all his textbooks at a knockdown price. So I decided to do it as a sort of a third option, and then that quickly became my main subject at university. In terms of what I'm doing now, there was a bit of I initially was a civil servant within the government heritage agency, which used to be called the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historic Monuments of Scotland. That's a bit of quick Glaswegian speaking there, but it's now part of Historic Environment Scotland. And I kind of managed to get this academic post at a time when it was much easier to get an academic job than it is now, in 2000. So if I hadn't got this job, then I would have probably now still been a civil servant, probably pushing pens at Historic Scotland and rubber stamping scheduling applications and looking at policy documents and stuff like that, which would have been nowhere near as much fun as the stuff that I do now. So I'm quite pleased that I went down the more action-orientated line of archaeology than the bureaucratic line of archaeology.
Awesome. Olivia?
I feel like I still don't really know where I'm currently going in my career, but I guess that's the blessing of being 23. So who knows where next year I might even end up. It could be completely different. But for me, like I mentioned earlier on, what really got me into Second World War history was watching Band of Brothers, and I was always really inspired by Doc Rowe's episode, and from that moment I really wanted to be a medic in the army, and it's something I would seriously consider even doing now. I've got 2 dodgy knees that I don't think are going to really allow me to run onto the front line, unfortunately, but it's always something I've kind of had in the back burner and thought about. I think it just kind of seems very heroic, and I've always loved kind of like medical, just like understanding how the human body works and kind of how you can fix it. And maybe I think I like the idea of then the army and combining the two. I just think it's something, but I know what I'm like. I'm a bit of a princess, so I don't think I'd be able to cope that well at all. So it's probably best that I'm a historian.
Taff?
Yeah, well, in a different lifetime, I was my background was design, design work, film and television design. Doing television graphics and things like that. As I say, I ran the audiovisual design department for BT's research place at Martlesham Heath. And really just a whole series of companies gradually being shut down one after the other till I'd run out of other places to work for and started working for myself, still doing mostly design work. I mean, it was at the time the internet was all new, and so I was doing a lot of touchscreen interactives and stuff like that for museums. That slipped into more military museums, and then eventually just by a whole series of consequences and lucky breaks just into doing the advising stuff. and from doing the advising, we then ended up setting up Khaki Devil, and the rest is history. So, yeah, if I wasn't doing this, I'd probably still be doing design work or design or film work, really, because I also we used to produce and direct films for BT and things like that. So yeah, it would be something along those lines, I reckon, but nowhere near as much fun as what we do now.
Brilliant. Callum.
Yeah, this was sort of the question I was dreading, because in terms of, if I wasn't doing the job I'm doing now, I would probably be standing on a street corner yelling at people about 14th, 15th century Scottish history. To be honest, I can't imagine what I would be doing if people weren't paying me to, do the nearest equivalent to that. But in terms of kind of looking at crossroads moments, when I first came to uni here at Edinburgh, way back in 2005, I already really wanted to sort of stay on and do sort of PhD stuff and be a historian, but I thought I wanted to do sort of Napoleonic, late 18th, early 19th century history. And I took in first year what was then called Scottish History 1, which was the kind of medieval Scottish course, just because it was my first time in Scotland, and so it was my kind of outside history sort of credit that I had to take. And the first two lecturers there, James Fraser and Steve Boardman, were so phenomenally enthusiastic, so kind of engaging, and made this, potentially quite remote history so sort of personalized and kind of believable. These characters like William Wallace and Robert Bruce, who are so often are presented as these kind of larger than life, almost kind of legendary figures, who made them seem like real people, and I was just hooked. And I sort of, over the course of the 4 years of doing doing undergrad, just slowly kind of passed off all of the sort of modern history stuff that had interested me when I was at school, and drifted into medieval history. So yeah, I guess that's if that hadn't happened and it hadn't kind of suckered me into Scottish history, I guess maybe I would be doing something vaguely Napoleonic. But yeah, I think that's about the closest to a sort of crossroads moment when I think back that I can.
It's funny that there's a kind of a theme that people aren't really, we're not really venturing that far from sort of what we do there. I mean, maybe Olivia with the medic and Jessie with the farming or something like that. We're kind of staying within our comfort area, it seems like. So we are. Simon, yourself.
In high school, I always was, or I still are, very interested in aviation. So as a 16, 17-year-old, I also wanted to be a fighter pilot. So I actually applied with the Belgian Air Force when I was 17, and I did all the tests. And then one of the last days I was declined because I don't have good night vision. But if that wasn't the case, I probably was not going to be sitting here talking about archaeology. So somehow it's good that I was declined, because I love my job as it is now. But I actually was going to do something completely different than what I'm doing now.
And that selfishly fills me with horror, because people might not realise that the doctorate that I'm kind of nearing the end of at the moment is about Hill 80, Hill 80 is a big part of it, and obviously Simon was the lead archaeologist on that. So if you were a fighter pilot, I dread to think what I'd be doing right now. So no, I'm glad that your night vision is really bad, so that's worked out well. And then last but not least, if I've not missed anyone, it should be Bethany.
Yeah, I mean, I think much like Olivia, I've been quite lucky in the fact that history is over. I loved it when I was at school. I loved it when I was at uni. Got into being a tour guide as well. So I suppose there was a bit of time prior to becoming a tour guide, where I almost didn't become a tour guide because the company that I worked for said I wasn't quite ready. And I almost threw in the towel and thought, never mind this, I'll go and do something else. But I didn't, I persevered. But I probably would have, I was doing the courses and the tests you had to do a PGCE. So I probably would have ended up as a history teacher. But I got into tour guiding instead because I don't have to deal with all the paperwork that comes with being a teacher.
Brilliant. I have asked everyone that, I think, and that technically, as far as pre-prepared questions, is the last one, and we are now slightly over time. But really, just from myself, 2 sessions tonight. I'm incredibly humbled and really grateful to you guys and the folks before. Thank you very much for giving up your time, not only tonight, but in previous conversations. It really does mean a lot to me. And that's not just words, I really do mean that. So thank you very much. Everyone who's watching live, I hope you've enjoyed it. And certainly this will be put up onto the Past Conversations website for future posterity, for future people to enjoy. But thank you very much for tuning in this evening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.